Hello, my name is Thomas Crowl, and I'm the author of Queen of the Con, this book right here, which is the first nonfiction biography study of the career of Cassie Chadwick, who is probably the most famous North American imposter and swindler that you've never heard of. Cassie Chadwick operated primarily in Cleveland from a period of about 1895 to about 1905. She was listed on Time magazine's accounting of swindlers and imposters as being number 8. All the rest were men. She was born in Canada. She was born Betsy Bigley in Ontario near Eastwood, and she lived most of her unremarkable childhood there. At the age of 16, she ran away from home for the first time and was detained by the police for trying to pawn a stolen gold pocket watch. She was released into the custody of her parents. She continued to run away from home off and on. By the time she reached 21, she was ready to move on to bigger and better things. And she spent that time being many different things, but the most interesting was trying to impersonate a member of the Kennard family of the shipping line fame. She also claimed to be an heiress. She had cards printed up that said Betsy Bigley, heiress to $15,000. She eventually discovered forged promissory notes. And I should perhaps clarify here that in the late 19th century, it was not uncommon for men of wealth to pay their debts by issuing personal promissory notes. These were somewhat similar to checks, somewhere between a cross between a personal check and a loan. And the maker of any particular promissory note would simply put his signature on it, fill in the blanks as to how long it was, how much money there was, what the interest would be, and his promise to pay in a year. Of course, the value of these varied greatly depending on the honor of the man involved and whether or not people felt he had the money to pay it. It was also a ripe area for fraud. These promissory notes, blank promissory notes, could be purchased at about any stationery store in North America during the late 19th century. All you had to do was fill in the blanks. Betsy Bigley figured this out, and she began creating fraudulent promissory notes. She was arrested when she was 22 in Canada, in Ontario, for attempting to pass these forged promissory notes. She was detained by the police in Brantford, Ontario, and she was eventually arrested and tried in Woodstock at the age of 22. She was tried for passing these promissory notes, which were filled out in amounts up to $500. Her defense counsel decided to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. And on the day of the trial, they had her, although she was 22, dressed in a child's clothing, complete with a child's bonnet, sit at the defense table, resting her head in her hand, and occasionally looking up to make funny faces or stick her tongue out at the jury. The judge decided that the jury should accept the insanity defense and directed them to do so. Took them 2 hours to decide, nevertheless, but she was acquitted for insanity. Her parents at this point had had enough of her in Canada, so they shipped her to her older sister who lived in Cleveland. And as you can imagine, there was a lot that she could learn in Cleveland about the criminal world in the 1870s and 80s. And she got into various different scrapes, various different frauds, various different blackmailing schemes. Along the way, she did manage to con a fairly respectable physician who was about 12 or 15 years older than her to marry her. And she convinced him that she was a wealthy heiress of some refinement, and he fell for it. On the day of the wedding, it turned out that she had borrowed some money from a money lender, which was not uncommon in those days. People mortgaged their furniture, even their clothing, to get extra cash at times. And she had borrowed some money from the money lender, which she had been a little late in repaying. He showed up at the home where the wedding was going to be held the afternoon before the wedding. She offered to pay him after the wedding was over. He declined, and she ended up signing over all of her wedding gifts, her wedding ring, her wedding dress, just about everything, to the moneylender to get him to go away. The marriage took place that evening, and the next morning the moneylender came back to get all of his collateral. When her new husband, Dr. Springsteen, found out that this was the case, he was obviously chagrined, and it took him about 2 weeks to throw her out of the house. In the meantime, he had had private detectives look into her activities, and one of the reasons for expelling her was infidelity. Dr. Springsteen eventually divorced Betsy. From there, she knocked around the United States, New York, Ohio, spent some time again, apparently in Canada. She was in Michigan. She may have even been as far as the Nebraska, Kansas area. There's a lot of uncertainties about where she was during this time, but the next time she came to the attention of the authorities and the press was in Toledo, when she opened up shop as a clairvoyant, which was a fancy name for a fortune teller. She claimed to be a European clairvoyant who could see the future or whatever else you wanted seen for a price. Some people, she claimed, some men, she claimed, came to see her for advice on grain futures or stock purchases or affairs of the heart. Surprisingly enough, all of her clients were men. She continued along this vein in Toledo until she again came up with forged personal promissory notes, and she managed to con a very respectable express agent who was 15 years older than her into helping her to pass these notes, in other words, to turn the notes into money. His reasons for doing so were varied, but it appears that in the end, they had to deal with blackmail and his having rendezvous at her home with a woman from Cleveland whose reputation was somewhat dicey. So Along the way, they managed to swindle about $20,000 from some Toledo banks, as well as a considerable amount of money from the victim himself, or you call the victim, the express agent. The whole thing finally fell apart when the man whose name she had forged was made aware of the promissory notes, disavowed them, got the police involved, and she and her assistant were both arrested. They were eventually tried. She was convicted and sentenced to prison. Her associate, it turns out, was found not guilty on the apparently acceptable defense that she had hypnotized him, and therefore he was not capable of functioning in a normal manner. He got off. She went to prison eventually after her appeals were exhausted. She went to prison in Ohio at the Ohio Penitentiary. She was paroled about 3 to 4 years later by none other than Ohio Governor William McKinley, who later became US President William McKinley. She returned to Cleveland, supposedly a penniless ex-con, and within a year and a half, she owned a number of row houses in Cleveland, a very nice wardrobe that amounted to more than 50 expensive gowns, and whatever other trappings went along with all of this. It was clear that she had friends in high places, and it turned out that back in the 1880s, before she had gone to prison, she had had a child whose name was Emil. His last name was always given as Hoover, but this was an alias. And he was apparently the illegitimate offspring of a rather well-to-do, but not terribly honest Cleveland politician. The man was never named, although a lot of people claim to know. I could find nowhere where there was ever a name. Anyway, she managed to take her contacts and use them to create quite a little nest egg for herself in a very short period of time. Some people said that during this period she was a madam in a house of ill repute. This is probably not exactly true. She probably did, however, run what were known as houses of assignation, which today might be considered low-end hotels where you could rent rooms by the day or by the hour for whatever purpose you needed. They could also be quite lucrative. She met another physician in Cleveland. This fellow's name was Leroy Chadwick. He was a widower. He had come from a wealthy Cleveland family. They were some of the original folks in Cleveland, some of the original folks who helped to develop Euclid Avenue, which was at the time that she was in Cleveland was known as Millionaires Row. People like John D. Rockefeller lived there, senators lived there, captains of industry. It was a very exclusive address, and Dr. Chadwick had a home there. She apparently convinced Dr. Chadwick, much as she had Dr. Springsteen, of her sad but pure past, and she went on to pursue him, and he was a physician, but not terribly bright and not terribly successful and in need of money. And it was almost no time at all before she had assumed control of his financial affairs, moved into his home in Cleveland on Euclid Avenue, and generally took control of everything. They were married about 1896, and as it was, they were married not once in Pittsburgh, which was the first time, but it was thought that because her Canadian citizenship might be a little dicey, they went to the Detroit area, crossed over into Canada, and were married there a second time 6 months later, just to make sure everything was correct. From there, she began a climb. She wished her goal in life was to become one of the top 5%, so to speak, and she achieved this very quickly with the Euclid Avenue home. This led to trips to Europe. She spent extensive time in New York, living in hotels and shopping. She had major shopping sprees. She outfitted her home in the latest, she had it remodeled, had it completely fixed up and updated. She had a large organ installed just for Chadwick, who liked to play the organ and was apparently quite good at it. She had huge collection of jewelry and gemstones. It's been rumored, although it's certainly not by any means proven, but it was rumored at the time that she imported the largest diamond into Canada that had ever been brought to the country at that point in time. Because of her gemstones and purchases overseas, she had a lot of trouble with US Customs and was investigated by Customs, but she managed to get an Ohio Senator, Mark Hanna, to bail her out of those. And he was also a resident of Millionaires Row, and he's known as the man who financed William McKinley's presidential campaign. I've got a little section here from the book that I'm going to read a little bit about this is probably one of the best known stories about Cassie Chadwick. Whether it's true, I think there's probably some truth to it, but it may not be exact. It's been presented in many different fashions over the years, but it gives you a little bit of an idea about what the woman was like and how she operated. And this was a case where she was taking a wealthy Cleveland attorney with her to see, purportedly, Andrew Carnegie. In New York City in the spring of 1904, Mrs. Cassie Chadwick, a wealthy resident of Cleveland's fashionable Euclid Avenue, met a prominent Cleveland attorney, a florid-faced, prosperous man with a professional air and a propensity to gossip, in the lobby of the exclusive Holland House Hotel. Unbeknown to the barrister, he was about to become an unwitting accomplice in one of the most audacious frauds in American history. It was a pleasant carriage ride up Fifth Avenue to the magnificent mansion of Andrew Carnegie, where Mrs. Chadwick had promised her companion an introduction to the famous industrialist. Arriving at the mansion, Cassie tactfully suggested that the attorney wait in the carriage while she asked if Mr. Carnegie was home to visitors. The woman strode unhesitantly to the front door, was admitted, and with a jaunty wave to her companion, disappeared inside. Mrs. Chadwick informed the butler that she wished to speak to the housekeeper about a former employee of the Carnegie household. The employee was unknown to the housekeeper, and the two women talked. Cassie, as they talked, took notes and stalled for time. 20 minutes later, she reemerged from the mansion, chirping pleasantly and waving. Once again, seated in the cab, Cassie apologized to her companion, but Mr. Carnegie was not receiving visitors today. Then, as if on cue, a package fell from her handbag. After the attorney retrieved it, Mrs. Chadwick said she wished to confide in him. After extracting a pledge of secrecy, Cassie admitted she was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter. Her mother had died, and according to Cassie, Carnegie had discreetly placed her with foster parents in Canada. The ironmaster was very generous to her, she said, and the package, which had fallen from her purse, contained U.S. steel bonds. To seal the deception, Cassie displayed 2 promissory notes with 6 figures on each to her benefit, bearing the signature of Andrew Carnegie. As the carriage pulled away from the curb, the attorney could not resist a backward glance at the mansion and later swore that he saw a short, gray-bearded man standing in an upstairs window. Such was the power of Cassie Chadwick's persuasion. She used this persuasion along with promissory notes that were supposedly signed by Carnegie but were forged, and also a trust agreement from Carnegie, which said that he had in his possession $10 million worth of securities belonging to her that he held in trust for Cassie Chadwick. These securities, $10 million at the time, today would be about $250 million US. Cassie had an insatiable demand for money, and she used these promissory notes, these forged notes and the trust agreement as collateral to borrow money. She borrowed it from individuals as well as borrowing it from banks. Nobody during the entire time that she was doing this ever bothered to ask Andrew Carnegie if his signature on any of this was genuine or if any of it was real. Everyone was all too happy to give her the money without ever checking to see if her credentials or if her collateral amounted to anything. The entire scheme eventually became unraveled when a small national bank in the small town of Oberlin, Ohio, which is the home of Oberlin College, when this small bank collapsed because it held Chadwick paper, Carnegie paper, which everybody had by now decided was worthless. So completely had she plundered the bank that there wasn't even enough money left to come close to covering the bank's deposits. There was a run on the bank and it collapsed. The bank examiners found that it had been thoroughly looted. And to make a long story short, Cassie was indicted for conspiracy to defraud a national bank. She eventually stood trial in the United States in Cleveland, federal trial for defrauding the bank. Her defense, while probably correct, was also inept in so much as they defended her by saying that there was no, her defense was that there was no conspiracy. She had not actually passed the notes. She had only used them for collateral, for loans, and whether the bankers chose to give her money on those notes or not was their business and not illegal. This all sounded good and made perfect legal sense, but unfortunately the 12 male jurors composed of farmers and tradesmen, what they really understood was that a bank had collapsed and people had lost a lot of money. In reality, people did lose money when the bank collapsed, but the small depositors were all made whole again by none other than Andrew Carnegie, who didn't wish to see anyone suffer as a result of this. So he put up the money to help the small depositors, the farmers, the tradesmen, the students, and so forth. And to help the deal along, he also threw in a library for Oberlin. Cassie was found guilty, sentenced to prison. She went back to the Ohio Penitentiary, this time as a federal prisoner. From the day she arrived there, her health deteriorated. This was in 1905. And in the fall of 1907, she passed away. She was only about 50 years old. She was buried in St. Paul's Episcopal Church Cemetery in Woodstock, Ontario. A large granite monument was placed on her grave, one which would both suit her in terms of its size and help to discourage grave robbers. And it was inscribed Elizabeth Bigley, wife of L.S. Chadwick, M.D., 1859 to 1907. Even in death, she couldn't resist shaving a couple of years off of her age. Her son, Emil, was her only regular visitor in prison, was an extremely loyal lad, and was in his 20s at the time that she died, time that she passed away. After her death, the story didn't end, the story didn't go away. The federal authorities had forced her into bankruptcy in an effort to try to collect money to pay the bank depositors, among others. They auctioned off all of her home belongings, seized all they could find, but they didn't, in the end, find very much. And it turns out that most of what was in the house was a lot of expensive claptrap that wasn't worth a whole lot, even if she did pay a whole lot for it. However, she had taken with her to prison a satchel which contained important personal papers that no one was ever allowed to look at. After she died, some pressure was applied to her son, and he agreed to let her satchel be examined. They found a lot of stuff, a lot of papers that didn't amount to much. They did find some old bank passbooks, and they did find one bank passbook that showed a $305,000 deposit and no withdrawals. They contacted the bank, who said no, there was no money on deposit there for her. And other people stepped forward and said that she had a tendency to fill in the blanks a lot of times in her own, in other passbooks, in other banks. However, this particular bank was in a way connected with a Pittsburgh industrialist who, it turned out, had used her to launder money that he had stolen from his partner in return for a loan. The big question with Cassie Chadwick is, what happened to the money? Nobody knows. Did all the money just disappear? Did she spend it all? Nobody thought she spent it all. What happened to her son, Emil Hoover? After her death, he disappeared, probably into Canada, but there seems to be no trace of him. There is no doubt that Cassie Chadwick was a very intelligent, very clever, very adventurous, very persuasive woman. She may have been a career criminal, but she certainly did not, in her cons and in her actions, allow the gender standards and the gender norms of the day to get in her way. She was an extraordinary person and certainly deserves a closer look than she's had in the past. The book, Queen of the Con, is available from Amazon, both in the United States and in Canada. You can also find it at some libraries, some bookstores. Obviously, there's a great deal more detail to be found in the book about her life and about her cons and about her various activities. And I would hope that you would either borrow or purchase a copy and find out more about the really extraordinary Cassie Chadwick. Thank you.